They called him William the Bastard. Asterisk, not out of affection, but out of scorn. Born illegitimate, in a time when bloodlines defined your destiny, William of Normandy should have been forgotten by history. Instead, he rewrote it. From a boy surrounded by enemies who wanted him dead to a conqueror who changed England forever, his story is one of survival, ambition. Imagine being born into a world. Imagine being born into a world where your very existence is questioned. Where every noble in your land whispers that you should not even wear the title you carry. Where assassins lurk in the shadows, and your only protection is the loyalty of a handful of men who could betray you tomorrow. That was the childhood of William of Normandy. He was born in the year 1028. In the fortress town of Falaise, located in the Duchy of Normandy area in northern France that had once been ruled by Viking settlers. His father was Robert I, Duke of Normandy, a man of immense power, but short-lived fortune. His mother, Herleva, was not a duchess, not even a noblewoman, but the daughter of a local tanner. This meant William carried a stain in the eyes of the aristocracy. He was illegitimate, a bastard. At first glance, you might think that being called the bastard was simply an insult shouted by enemies. But in the Middle Ages, legitimacy was everything. A king's crown, a duke's authority, even a knight's inheritance all depended on being born in wedlock. Without it, your claim was fragile, and your enemies had every excuse to try and take it from you. But Duke Robert acknowledged William as his son, and when Robert died suddenly in 1035, young William, just 8 years old, inherited the Duchy of Normandy. And that's when his troubles truly began. Think about this. Normandy was not a peaceful land. It was a place forged by Vikings and ruled by warlords who had no patience for weakness. And suddenly, this powerful duchy was placed in the hands of a child who had no royal mother to protect him, no strong dynasty to back him, and no ability to wield a sword. The Norman lords, fierce, proud, and ambitious, looked at this boy with contempt. Many openly mocked him. Some whispered that Normandy deserved a stronger leader. Others plotted to simply remove him permanently. For William, growing up was not about toys or games. It was about survival. Assassination attempts came early and often. Chroniclers later recorded that his guardians had to move him from castle to castle, sometimes in the dead of night, to keep him alive. At one point, his chamberlain, essentially his household protector, was murdered while William slept nearby. The message was clear. The boy's not safe anywhere. Imagine being 10 years old and waking up every day not knowing if your food would be poisoned, if your guardian would betray you, or if the next knock at the door would be an assassin's blade. When his father, Duke Robert, had left for a pilgrimage to Jerusalem where he died, he had entrusted William to the guardianship of several nobles. But one after another, they were killed, assassinated, or turned against him. The Duchy of Normandy descended into chaos. Lords fought each other for power, castles were seized, and villages burned. It was said that William's early years were marked not just by fear, but by the constant sound of swords clashing in the distance. Yet even in these dark years, William showed an unusual strength. He survived not because of luck alone, but because he learned fast. He learned whom to trust, when to stay silent, how to make enemies fear him. One of the most important figures in William's survival was King Henry I of France. Henry was no saint, but he recognized that a destabilized Normandy would be dangerous for his own kingdom. So, he supported the boy Duke sometimes with words, sometimes with soldiers. This alliance gave William just enough breathing room to grow older and begin asserting himself. By the time he reached his teenage years, he was already battle-tested, not as a warrior yet, but as a survivor of court intrigue. But the shadow of his illegitimacy never went away. Throughout his youth, his rivals taunted him. They used it as propaganda, claiming he had no right to rule Normandy at all. To the nobles, William was always William the Bastard, a title meant to humiliate him and strip away his authority. Instead of breaking him, though, this insult hardened him. He wore it like armor, turning the word into a weapon. Every time someone called him the bastard, William heard a challenge, and he accepted. This psychological toughness, this refusal to bend, was one of the greatest lessons of his childhood, or another boy might have collapsed under. The pressure William grew sharper, stronger, more ruthless. By the early 1040s, Normandy was a land of rebellion. Noble families tried to seize castles, overthrow William, or set up rival claimants. The bloodshed was constant. But here's where William's story becomes astonishing. Still a teenager, he began to personally take command. He wasn't just hiding behind protectors anymore. He was riding into battle. One of the most decisive moments came at the Battle of Valles Dunes in 1047. Rebels challenged his rule, but William, with the help of King Henry of France, crushed them. It was his first major victory. The boy who had once been hunted like prey had now proven himself as a predator. From then on, William's authority grew. Nobles who once mocked him now thought twice before crossing him. These years of turmoil transformed William. By his late teens, he had seen more bloodshed, betrayal, and near-death experiences than most men twice his age. He had learned diplomacy, the hard way by watching allies turn into enemies overnight. He had learned leadership not in schoolrooms, but on battlefields filled with corpses. And most importantly, he had learned that survival in Normandy required one thing above all else: ruthless determination. So why did William survive when so many wanted him dead? Historians point to several reasons. His father's acknowledgement. Even though William was illegitimate, Duke Robert had recognized him, giving his claim legal standing. A core of loyalists. Despite the betrayals, William always had a few powerful men who stood by him. The support of King Henry I of France. Without it, William might not have lasted. William's own willpower. From a young age, he showed an iron will that others could not break. But perhaps the most important factor was William's own mindset. While other children played, he grew up in a crucible of violence and treachery. Every attempt on his life made him colder, sharper, more prepared for the challenges to come. By the time William reached adulthood, he was no longer the fragile boy called the bastard. He was a young man who had stared death in the face countless times and lived to tell the tale. This dangerous childhood forged the man who would later cross the English Channel, win the Battle of Hastings, and become William the Conqueror. Because, here's the truth, without surviving Normandy's chaos, he could never have conquered England. His childhood was his training ground. The rebellions, the betrayals, the assassinations, all of it was the furnace in which his character was forged. And while his enemies thought they were weakening him, in reality, they were shaping one of the most determined rulers in history. Picture it, a small boy, shivering in a dark castle, knowing that someone outside the walls wants him dead. He hears whispers in the corridors, daggers unsheathed in the night. And yet he survives. He grows. He becomes harder than iron. That's not just a childhood. That's a legend in the making. When we look back at William's reign as King of England, it's easy to focus on the Battle of Hastings or the castles he built.
Wow.
But the real story begins here, in Normandy, with a boy who refused to die, who refused to give up, and who turned the insult of bastard into the title of conqueror. When William became Duke of Normandy as a boy, his enemies expected him to collapse. They saw a child with no strong family connections, no powerful mother to guard his rights, and no experience in leadership. But by the time he grew into his teenage years, William had already survived more assassination attempts than most men face in a lifetime. And with each attempt, each betrayal, he became stronger. This is the story of how William still, barely a man, fought to keep his throne against ruthless nobles, rebellious lords, and even supposed allies. By the early 1040s, William was entering his teenage years. He was still called William the Bastard by his enemies, but now he was old enough to ride, old enough to fight, and old enough to make his presence felt. The Norman lords had underestimated him. They thought he would remain a weak boy, forever dependent on protectors. Instead, William began taking control, slowly but surely. But Normandy was not an easy land to rule. The duchy had been carved out by Viking warriors just a century before. Its nobles were tough, proud, and violent. They didn't respect birthrights, they respected strength. And if William couldn't prove he had it, they were ready to overthrow him. From the moment William could sit a horse, he was forced into battle. Almost every year, A new rebellion rose up. One noble after another tried to test him. Some wanted to replace him with another claimant. Others simply wanted to break away and rule their own lands. Castles were seized, villages burned, and alliances shifted like the wind. But William had something his enemies didn't expect: a stubborn refusal to surrender. Every rebellion that rose against him only gave him another chance to prove himself. He fought sometimes against overwhelming odds, and began building a reputation, not as a boy who inherited a title, but as a warrior who could defend it. At first, William was cautious. He had advisors, older warriors who guided him. But quickly, he began taking personal command. He rode into battle alongside his men. He studied tactics. He learned how to read the terrain, how to exploit weaknesses, and how to inspire soldiers to fight for him. One chronicler wrote that William had the ability to fight like a lion and endure like steel. That endurance became his greatest weapon. One of the most dangerous uprisings came in 1046, when a group of Norman lords attempted to assassinate William near Valognes. He was still a teenager, but his enemies saw their chance. One night, while staying at a friend's castle, William received a warning. Assassins were coming. He fled in the darkness, riding desperately to safety. Imagine the scene this young Duke, barely out of boyhood, racing through the night, pursued by men who wanted his blood. He rode all the way to King Henry I of France, his overlord, and begged for help. Henry, seeing that a stable Normandy was in his own interest, agreed. Together, their combined forces met the rebels in battle. The clash came at Valais-Dunes in 1047. On one side, William and King Henry with loyal Norman knights. On the other, a coalition of rebellious Norman lords who believed William's rule was finished. The battle was brutal. Norman knights charged across the fields, lances lowered, the clash of steel echoing through the valley. At one point, the rebel army seemed strong enough to hold. But William and Henry pressed on, their knights smashing through enemy lines. By the end of the day, the rebels were broken. Some were cut down in battle, others drowned in the river. As they tried to flee, William had won. But this wasn't just a victory, it was a turning point. For the first time, William had proven, not only to his enemies but also to his allies, that he was capable of ruling as a warrior duke. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was fighting back. After Valais-Dunes, the rebellions didn't stop completely, but they changed. Fewer nobles were willing to openly defy William. They had seen what he could do on the battlefield. They had seen his determination. This was when William began shaping his rule. He understood that Normandy could not be governed by kindness alone. It had to be governed by fear, respect, and loyalty. He started rewarding loyal supporters with land and punishing traitors with merciless severity. Some rebels were executed, others were exiled, and some had their lands seized and given to William's allies. Every rebellion William crushed made him stronger. Every battle made him more feared. William's childhood had taught him that mercy was dangerous. A spared enemy today could become a traitor tomorrow. As a young man, he developed a reputation for ruthlessness. If a castle resisted him, he burned its lands. If a noble betrayed him, William made an example of him. He ruled not with half measures, but with decisive, sometimes brutal action. And yet, people followed him. Why? Because they saw strength in him. They saw a man who could keep order in a land of chaos. And in the 11th century, strength meant survival. By his late teens, William was no longer just defending himself. He was actively taking the fight to his enemies. He rode at the front of his cavalry, sword in hand, leading charges. He had grown tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that commanded authority. Chroniclers later wrote that William was so powerful on horseback that he could wear chainmail all day without tiring. That endurance, combined with his sharp mind, made him both respected and feared. Through endless battles, William began to reshape Normandy into a duchy firmly under his control. The rebellious nobles who had once mocked him were either dead, defeated, or loyal to him. It was not an easy process. It took years of war, countless struggles, and endless risk. But step by step, William transformed from a hunted child into a powerful duke whose authority could no longer be questioned. By the time William reached his 20s, Normandy was no longer laughing at him. The boy once called the bastard was now the undisputed Duke of Normandy. And that's the irony. His enemies had tried for years to destroy him, but in doing so, they had only made him stronger. They had trained him in the harshest possible way by forcing him to fight for every inch of power. Those years of struggle built the man who would later cross the Channel and claim the crown of England. Without these battles, without this constant fight to keep his throne, William might never have had the strength or experience to attempt conquest. When you look at William the Conqueror's story, it's tempting to jump straight to 1066, the invasion of England and the Battle of Hastings. But the truth is, the seeds of that conquest were planted here, in Normandy, during his youth. This was his training ground. Every assassination attempt made him more cautious. Every rebellion made him more ruthless. Every victory made him more confident. He was not born a conqueror. He was forged into one hammered by rebellion, sharpened by betrayal, and hardened by war. William's fight to keep his throne teaches a simple but powerful lesson. Greatness is rarely handed down. It is seized, often at a cost. William didn't inherit stability. He didn't inherit peace. He inherited chaos, enemies, and insults. But instead of letting them define him, he used them to build the foundations of his power. The boy mocked as the bastard was now a duke feared across Normandy. The world had only just begun to see what he was capable of. By the time William had fought through the rebellions of his youth, Normandy was finally under his control. But survival alone wasn't enough. If he was going to keep his duchy strong and if he was going to be taken seriously by the great powers of Europe, he needed something more. He needed legitimacy. He needed allies. And in the medieval world, nothing built alliances like marriage. In the 11th century, marriage wasn't just about romance. It was politics. Who you married could change the balance of power, open doors to alliances, or close them forever. William may have been Duke of Normandy, but he was still marked by the stain of illegitimacy. No matter how many battles he won, many noble families still saw him as William the Bastard. If he wanted to strengthen his rule and secure his dynasty, he needed a wife of noble blood. But not just any noblewoman would do. William aimed high. He set his sights on Matilda of Flanders. Matilda was the daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders, one of the most powerful rulers in northern Europe. Flanders was rich, influential, and strategically located along the trade routes of the North Sea. Marrying Matilda would bring William prestige, powerful allies, and most importantly, legitimacy. In the eyes of Europe, it was the perfect match politically. But there was a problem. Matilda didn't want him. According to medieval chroniclers, when William first proposed marriage to Matilda, she flatly refused. Why? Because she considered herself above him. She was a noble woman of royal blood, descended from kings. William, though a duke, was the illegitimate son of a tanner's daughter. To Matilda, marrying him seemed beneath her dignity. This rejection could have ended the matter right there. Many men would have accepted the insult and moved on. But William was not like other men. Here's where the story takes a dramatic, almost shocking turn. According to one famous account, William didn't take no for an answer. Instead, he rode to Bruges, where Matilda was living, and confronted her in public. What he did next has been retold for centuries. In a fit of fury and determination, William supposedly grabbed Matilda by her hair, or in some versions, threw her to the ground, and declared that she would be his wife, or he would never marry anyone else. Now, by modern standards, this story sounds harsh, even brutal. But in the medieval world, this act of raw force and dominance was sometimes interpreted differently. Rather than being offended, Matilda was said to have been impressed. In William, the kind of fearless, commanding strength she admired. Whether this story is entirely true or partly legend, one thing is certain. William's determination left an impression on Matilda. In the end, Matilda agreed to marry William. But it wasn't just about his bold gesture. She likely realized that marrying William would bring her political power and influence as well. Together, they could form a formidable partnership. but not everyone approved. In fact, the church itself opposed the marriage. William and Matilda were distant cousins, which in the eyes of the Catholic Church made their marriage too close for comfort. Pope Leo IX initially forbade it, citing concerns of consanguinity being related by blood. This was dangerous. A marriage without papal approval could be declared invalid, and William couldn't afford that scandal. But William was shrewd. To win the church's favor, he and Matilda founded the Abbey of Saint-Étienne in Caen and the Abbey of Saint-Trinit for women. These grand religious buildings were not just acts of piety, they were political moves to buy goodwill from Rome. And it worked. Eventually, the marriage was officially recognized by the Pope. William and Matilda married around 1050. And unlike many medieval political unions, theirs became a genuine partnership. Matilda was not a passive duchess. She was intelligent, capable, and fiercely loyal. Chroniclers describe her as educated and pious, but also politically savvy. She managed estates, advised William, and acted as regent in Normandy when William was away. That meant when William went to war later, when he crossed the English Channel to fight for the crown of England, Matilda was trusted to govern in his place. That kind of trust was rare in the medieval world and speaks volumes about her ability. William and Matilda went on to have at least 10 children, a huge advantage in medieval politics. Their sons and daughters would become kings, queens, and pains, dukes across Europe, cementing the dynasty William had fought so hard to build. Their children included Robert Curthose, who became Duke of Normandy; William Rufus, who became King William II of England; Henry Beauclerc, who became King Henry I of England; and several daughters who married into powerful European families. Through these children, William and Matilda's bloodline spread across the continent, influencing politics for generations. What's striking about this part of William's life is how much Matilda seems to have meant to him personally. For a man known for his ruthlessness, William showed remarkable loyalty to his wife. Unlike many rulers of the time, he is not recorded as having taken mistresses or illegitimate children after their marriage. By all accounts, he remained faithful to Matilda. When she died in 1083, William was said to have been devastated. Chroniclers noted that he became more withdrawn, his temper harsher, his health weaker. For a man as unshakable as William, the loss of Matilda struck deeply. So why does this marriage matter so much in William's story? Because without Matilda, William might not have had the stability and legitimacy he needed. Her noble blood helped silence critics of his illegitimacy. Her political connections gave him allies. Her strength as regent allowed him to focus on his campaigns abroad. And their children created a dynasty that would dominate England and Normandy for centuries. This was not just a marriage, it was the cornerstone of William's power. William's marriage to Matilda also reflects a bigger theme in his life, his ability to turn obstacles into strengths. He was born illegitimate. He turned that insult into a badge of defiance, was surrounded by enemies as a child. Yet he used those years to become tougher than anyone expected. He was rejected by Matilda. He turned that rejection into a marriage that became his greatest political alliance. Time and time again, William refused to accept defeat. Instead, he transformed setbacks into stepping stones. By securing his marriage and his dynasty, William wasn't just protecting his duchy, he was laying the foundation for something much greater, his bid for the English throne. Because when King Edward, the Confessor of England, died in 1066, it was William's connection to Edward and his powerful, stable marriage to Matilda that strengthened his claim. Without that legitimacy, without that strong foundation, his invasion of England might never have been possible. At the heart of William's rise to power is this surprising love story. A duke once mocked for his illegitimacy won the hand of a noble woman who once rejected him. Together, they built a family, a partnership, and an empire. Their marriage was not only the story of two people, it was the story of power, survival, and the creation of a dynasty that shaped Europe for centuries. And when William finally crossed the Channel to fight for the crown of England, he didn't just carry the weight of his own ambition, he carried the strength of Matilda, the stability of their marriage, and the legacy of the children who would inherit his throne. It all began with a promise that would spark ambition, ignite betrayal, and ultimately lead to one of the most famous battles in all of history. By the 1050s, William of Normandy had secured his duchy. He had survived childhood assassins, crushed rebellions, and built a powerful alliance through his marriage to Matilda of Flanders. But across the English Channel, another stage was being set, a stage that would draw William into a Game of Thrones far bigger than Normandy. That stage was England. England in the mid-11th century was ruled by King Edward the Confessor. Edward was deeply religious, so religious, in fact, that many of his people believed he was more monk than king. He spent more time building churches, like the great Westminster Abbey, than preparing heirs or strengthening his dynasty. And here was the problem. Edward had no children. None. For a medieval kingdom, this was a disaster waiting to happen. Without an heir, the question of succession was wide open. Who would rule England after Edward? That uncertainty made England a target for ambitious men across Europe. So where did William fit into this picture? William believed he had a claim to the English throne, and it rested on two key connections. First, his bloodline. William's great-aunt, Emma of Normandy, had been Edward's mother. That meant Edward and William were distant relatives. Not a close tie, but close enough in an age where royal bloodlines mattered. Second, and more importantly, was a supposed promise. According to William and his supporters, Edward the Confessor had promised him the throne of England years earlier. Some sources say this happened around 1051, when Edward supposedly sent envoys to Normandy and invited William to be his successor. Why would Edward do this? Because Edward had spent part of his youth in Normandy, in exile, while Danish kings ruled England. During those years, Edward became close to the Norman court. He trusted Normans more than many of his own English nobles. And since he had no children of his own, it seemed natural, at least to him, to consider a Norman successor. For William, this promise became the foundation of his greatest ambition: the English crown. But there was a major obstacle standing in William's way: Harold Godwinson. Harold was no ordinary noble. He was the Earl of Wessex, the richest and most powerful man in England after the king himself. His family, the Godwins, were the real power behind the throne. Harold was strong, capable, and deeply entrenched in English politics. And while William might have been Edward's chosen heir, Harold had the home field advantage. He was English, was respected. And when the time came, many would rather see Harold crowned than a Norman duke from across the sea. Here's where the story takes a dramatic twist. In 1064, Harold Godwinson traveled to Normandy. The reasons are debated. Some say he was sent by Edward to confirm William's succession. Others claim Harold was simply shipwrecked and ended up in Normandy by accident. Whatever the case, William welcomed Harold with honor. But then he placed him in a dangerous trap. William demanded that Harold swear an oath. According to Norman sources, William made Harold place his hands on a chest of holy relics, bones of saints. Sacred objects, and swear that he would support William's claim to the English throne. This wasn't just a casual promise. In the medieval world, swearing on relics was deadly serious. Breaking such an oath was seen as a mortal sin. Harold swore. But whether he swore willingly or under pressure, you may never know. When Harold returned to England, the political landscape was shifting. Edward the Confessor's health was failing. Everyone knew the king was nearing death, and the question of succession was about to explode. William was confident. He believed Edward's promise, combined with Harold's oath, gave him the strongest claim. But William underestimated one thing: Harold's ambition. On January 5, 1066, King Edward the Confessor died. His death marked the end of the old royal line and left the throne wide open. The very next day, Harold Godwinson acted swiftly. He was crowned King Harold II of England at Westminster Abbey. It was bold, decisive, and, at least in William's eyes, complete betrayal. William believed the crown was his. Edward had promised it. Harold had sworn to support it. And yet Harold now wore it. When the news reached Normandy, William erupted. This was more than an insult. It was treachery. It was the breaking of sacred oaths, the stealing of what William believed was rightfully his. But William wasn't the type of man to sit and complain. He was the type of man to act. Immediately, he began preparing for war. William's claim to the throne was shaky in the eyes of many Europeans. After all, promises could be disputed and blood ties stretched thin. But William was a master of persuasion. He sent envoys to the Pope in Rome, arguing that Harold had broken a holy oath by swearing on relics and then seizing the crown for himself. The Pope, persuaded by William's case, gave him a special banner, a sign of papal approval for his cause. This was huge. With the Church's blessing, William could present his invasion not just as a war of ambition, but as a righteous mission. At the same time, William began assembling one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen. Knights from across Normandy and beyond flocked to his banner. Ships were built, supplies gathered. This wasn't just a rite, it was a full-scale invasion. In the making, meanwhile, Harold Godwinson knew William was coming. He strengthened England's defenses, gathered his own army, and prepared for war. But Harold faced challenges. England was vulnerable not just to William, but also to another rival, Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, who also claimed the English throne. In the late summer of 1066, Harald Hardrada invaded from the north, forcing Harold to rush his army to fight him at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Harold won a stunning victory, killing Hardrada and securing England's northern border. But his army was exhausted, and his victory came at a terrible cost, because even as he celebrated in the north, William was landing in the south by September 1066. William had crossed the English Channel with his massive invasion force. He landed at Pevensey, established a base, and prepared for the confrontation that would decide the fate of England. 2 men, 1 crown, a promise betrayed, a kingdom at stake. The stage was set for the Battle of Hastings, one of the most famous battles in history. Looking back, what's striking is how everything began with a promise. Did Edward the Confessor truly intend for William to succeed him? Did Harold swear his oath freely, or was it forced upon him? The truth may never be fully known. But in the medieval world, perception was everything. William believed the promise was real. He believed Harold's oath was binding. And when both were broken, he saw it as justification for war. That sense of righteous fury drove him to risk everything to build an army, to cross the sea, and to gamble his duchy on a single battle. And in doing so, William would change the course of English history forever. This chapter of William's life isn't just about politics or succession. It's about how fragile power can be. Single death, a single broken oath, and the fate of an entire kingdom hangs in the balance. It's also about William's character. Lesser men might have let Harold's betrayal stand. But William was not a man who accepted betrayal. He was a man who answered it with steel. And so as 1066 unfolded, England was thrust into chaos. Edward the Confessor lay in his grave. Harold Godwinson wore the crown, but faced threats from every side. And across the Channel, William of Normandy was preparing for the gamble of a lifetime. The promise had been made. The promise had been broken. And now the promise would be settled on the battlefield. Imagine this. You've fought your whole life for power. You've clawed your way from an unwanted child to a ruler feared across your lands. Then, finally, a crown you've dreamed of seems within reach. A dying king has no heir, and he's whispered a promise to youth that you, not another, will rule after him. You believe destiny is on your side, but then, a man you trusted betrays you. Not just any man, but one of the most powerful lords in the kingdom you seek to rule. That betrayal sets the stage for one of the most legendary battles in medieval history. That's the story of William of Normandy and Harold Gund. In 1064, 2 years before the storm of Hastings, Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, set sail across the English Channel. Some say he was traveling to Normandy as an ambassador for King Edward the Confessor. Others claim he was heading north on personal business and was blown off course. Whatever the reason, fate or maybe sheer bad luck pushed him toward William's lands. His ship wrecked near the coast of Ponthieu, in territory controlled by a rival noble. Normally, this would have been disastrous. Foreign nobles often ransomed or imprisoned unlucky travelers. But when word spread that the herald Godwin's son, the second most powerful man in England, was stranded on Norman shores, Duke William immediately acted. Instead of allowing Harold to rot in captivity, William stepped in, rescued him, and invited him to court. On the surface, it seemed like an act of generosity. But William wasn't a man who did favors without expecting something in return. William treated Harold well, showing him around Normandy, even taking him on military campaigns. The Norman chroniclers paint a picture of friendship and respect, but behind the smiles was a trap. William had ambitions for the English crown, and Harold was about to play a role in those plans. One day, William arranged a solemn ceremony. He invited Harold into a great hall where relics of saints' bones, holy objects, symbols considered sacred, were laid beneath a cloth-covered table. Harold was asked to place his hands upon the table and swear an oath. The oath that Harold would support William's claim to the English throne when Edward the Confessor died. Harold, perhaps feeling he had little choice, swore. Then William dramatically pulled away the cloth, revealing the sacred relics beneath. In medieval culture, swearing on such relics bound your soul before God himself. Breaking such an oath was not just political betrayal, it was spiritual damnation. For William, this was genius. Harold was now trapped. If he kept his word, William would have a powerful ally. If he broke it, William could call him an oath-breaker, a man cursed by God. Either way, William had the upper hand. Fast forward to January 1066. King Edward the Confessor of England lay dying. His reign had been long and peaceful, but he left no children, no clear heir. Different factions whispered different claims. Some said Edward had promised the crown to William of Normandy years earlier. Others insisted Edward's wife's family, the powerful Godwinsons, were better positioned to take control. On his deathbed, Edward supposedly lifted Harold's hand and entrusted him with the kingdom. For Harold, this was the chance of a lifetime. For William, it was an unforgivable betrayal. Just one day after Edward's death, Harold Godwinson crowned himself King of England at Westminster Abbey. The cheers of the English nobles echoed through the hall. Harold was no longer just an earl. He was Harold II, King of England. When the news reached Normandy, William's anger was volcanic. Imagine spending years believing you were promised a throne. It's only to watch another man seize it. Worse still, a man who had sworn loyalty to you on sacred relics. To William, Harold was not just a rival, he was a traitor. William was not a man to forgive betrayal. Chroniclers describe William pacing furiously, declaring Harold's oath breaking a crime against God and man. He wasted no time. Sent letters to the Pope arguing that Harold had broken a sacred promise. The Pope, eager to assert his influence, sided with William. He even sent William a papal banner blessing his invasion. This was more than politics now. It was a holy mission. William could frame his coming attack not as greed, but as justice, sanctioned by God himself. Harold wasn't blind to the storm brewing across the channel. He knew William was preparing for war. But Harold's problems didn't stop there. 2. The north, another threat loomed. Harald Hardrada, the fierce king of Norway, also claimed the English crown. England was about to be squeezed from two sides, and Harold was stuck in the middle. But here's the critical part. Harold's betrayal of William had consequences far beyond politics. In medieval Europe, reputation was everything. Kings ruled, not only by force, but by legitimacy, by the belief that God favored them. By breaking his oath, Harold gave William the perfect weapon. William could call him a liar, a perjurer, a man cursed by heaven. And in 1066, that kind of stain was deadly throughout the spring and summer of 1066. William worked tirelessly to prepare his invasion, summoned knights from across Normandy and beyond, promising them land and riches if they joined him. Had one advantage Harold could never match: the blessing of the Pope. Meanwhile, Harold rushed to secure his throne. He marched his armies across England, building defenses along the southern coast, waiting for the inevitable Norman invasion. But as fate would have it, the winds kept William's ships trapped in Normandy for months. Some might say God was testing Harold. Others might say William was biding his time. Either way, the tension stretched like a bowstring ready to snap. Looking back, Harold's decision to take the crown himself might seem bold, even heroic to the English. But from William's perspective, it was a personal insult of the highest order. The man who had sworn loyalty to him now sat on the throne he believed was his, by promise and by right. That betrayal lit the fuse. Without it, there might never have been a Norman conquest. No Battle of Hastings. No William the Conqueror. In the end, Harold's broken oath was more than just words. It became the spark that changed English history forever. So when you picture William crossing the English Channel with his fleet in 1066, don't just imagine a duke seeking glory. Imagine a man who felt betrayed to his core, a man who believed God himself demanded vengeance. And when the armies finally clashed at Hastings, it wasn't just a fight for a crown. It was the final chapter of a broken promise, oath sworn, unholy relics, and an oath shattered by ambition. And as history shows us, in the medieval world, there was no sin more dangerous than betrayal. It's late summer 1066. Along the Norman coast, thousands of men gather. The clanging of hammers, the creak of wooden planks, and the smell of pitch and tar fill the air. An entire fleet of ships is being prepared not for trade, not for exploration, but for the most ambitious invasion Europe had seen in centuries. At the center of it all is William, Duke of Normandy. His eyes are fixed across the English Channel. On the other side lies a kingdom he believes is rightfully his, stolen from him by Harold Godwinson. And William will not stop until the English crown sits on his head. This is the moment the world holds its breath. The invasion of England is about to begin. William was nothing if not thorough. Unlike many medieval lords who scrambled resources at the last minute, William planned with the precision of a general and the determination of a conqueror. He called upon every vassal, knight, and ally. Normandy alone couldn't provide enough manpower for such an audacious campaign, so William reached beyond his borders. From Brittany, Flanders, and even parts of France, men flocked to his banner. Why? Because William offered them something irresistible: land and riches in conquered England. But an army is useless if it can't cross the Channel. And so, shipbuilders worked day and night to create a fleet large enough to carry thousands of men, horses, and supplies. Imagine the sight. Row after row of long, sleek vessels, some estimates say around 700 ships. It wasn't just an army being prepared. It was a floating city of war. William had more than manpower and ships. It's something no medieval ruler could ignore: the blessing of the church. The Pope had sent him a sacred banner symbolizing that his cause was righteous and sanctioned by God himself. For the men about to risk their lives crossing a dangerous sea, this banner mattered more than gold. It gave them confidence that even death in battle meant salvation. For William, the papal banner was political gold. With it, he could tell his men and the world that Harold Godwinson was not just a usurper, but a sinner who had broken a holy oath. This invasion wasn't greed. It was justice. Summer dragged on. William's fleet was ready, his men eager, but the winds weren't in his favor. The English Channel is notoriously tricky, and weeks turned into months of waiting. Meanwhile, Harold Godwinson wasn't sitting idle. He gathered his own army and stationed them along the southern coast of England. His men watched and waited, knowing William could appear on the horizon at any moment. For Harold, this was a nightmare. He had already crowned himself king against controversy, and now he had to defend that crown from a man who claimed to have God on his side. But then, something happened that would change everything. While William's fleet sat stranded in Normandy, Harold received devastating news. To the north, a far greater threat had arrived: Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway. One of the most feared warriors of his age, Hardrada believed he had a claim to the English throne too, and he wasn't alone. He was joined by Harold Godwinson's own brother Tostig, who hated Harold and sought revenge. This meant Harold was trapped in an impossible situation. He couldn't keep his army on the southern coast forever. Supplies were running low, and men were restless. When he heard of the Norwegian invasion in the north, he made a risky decision. He marched his entire army nearly 200 miles in less than 2 weeks to meet Hardrada in battle. At Stamford Bridge, Harold pulled off a stunning victory. Hardrada and Tostig were killed, and the Norwegian threat was crushed. It should have been Harold's moment of triumph. Fate wasn't done with him yet. As Harold celebrated in the north, William's prayers were answered. The winds finally shifted. In late September 1066, his fleet set sail across the Channel. The sea, which had delayed him for so long, was now calm, as if guiding him toward destiny. Imagine the sight: hundreds of ships cutting through the water, carrying armored knights, archers, foot soldiers, and horses. The noise must have been thunderous, the beat of oars, the cries of men, the neighing of war horses. For many of these soldiers, it was their first time leaving Normandy. They weren't just fighting for William. They were fighting for a chance at a new life in England. The fleet landed at Pevensey Bay on the Sussex coast. There was no English army to oppose them. Harold's forces were still exhausted, celebrating their victory far to the north.
William wasted no time.
His men built a wooden fort at Pevensey and began raiding the surrounding countryside for supplies. It wasn't just practical, it was psychological warfare. William wanted the English people to know their new master had arrived. One of William's greatest strengths was discipline. Medieval armies were often little more than mobs of men with weapons, but William's forces were different. He trained his men to fight in formations, to hold ranks, and to combine cavalry, infantry, and archers in ways that gave him a deadly edge. As they marched inland from Pevensey, the Normans moved like a machine. They raided towns, seized food, and built another fort at Hastings, securing their position. William wasn't just invading. He was establishing a foothold, a base from which he could challenge Harold directly. And Harold was still in the north, unaware of how quickly the storm was gathering in the south. When news finally reached Harold that William had landed, he faced a brutal choice. His men were exhausted from marching north and back again, and many had been wounded at Stamford Bridge. Common sense said he should wait to rebuild his forces, rest his army, and then face William with fresh strength. But Harold wasn't a man who liked to wait. He feared that if he gave William time, more Normans would pour into England and the countryside would suffer. He decided to strike fast, hoping to catch William before the invasion gained momentum. So Harold gathered what forces he could and marched south again, covering nearly 250 miles in just a few days. It was a decision that would decide the fate of England. By October 13th, Harold reached the area near Hastings. His army set up camp on Senlac Hill, a strong defensive position. The English shield wall rows of warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with heavy shields was one of the most feared defensive tactics in Europe. From Harold's perspective, this was the perfect ground to face the Normans. Intimidated, he knew the battle would be brutal, but he believed he had something Harold lacked: cavalry, archers, and above all, divine blessing. That night, as the two armies camped within miles of each other, the air must have been thick with tension. Soldiers sharpened swords, whispered prayers, and wondered if they would live to see another sunrise. Both leaders knew the next day would decide not only who ruled England, but also the destiny of the entire nation. And so, on the eve of October 14th, 1066, the stage was set. On one side, Harold Godwinson, the battle-hardened king of England, fresh from a victory in the north, but weary from constant marches. On the other, William of Normandy, a duke-turned-invader, armed with the Pope's blessing and an army unlike anything England had ever faced. The invasion was complete. But the true test, the clash that would echo through history, was only hours away. The Battle of Hastings was coming. The morning of October 14th, 1066, dawned cold and misty over the rolling hills of southern England. Dew clung to the grass, and the air carried that tense stillness that always comes before a storm. Two armies faced each other, their fates tied, together by ambition, loyalty, and destiny. On one side, Harold Godwinson, the King of England, stood with his weary but determined men. They had marched hundreds of miles, fought 2 major battles within weeks, and were now bracing for a final, desperate defense of their homeland. On the other side, William, Duke of Normandy, sat mounted on his warhorse, eyes fixed on the ridge ahead where the English shield wall awaited. Behind him stretched his army archers, infantry and cavalry all, drilled, disciplined, and hungry for conquest. William wasn't here to test Harold's strength. He was here to claim a crown. This was more than a battle. It was the turning point of English history. Harold's army took the high ground on Senlac Hill, a ridge that gave them a strong defensive position. His forces numbered perhaps 7,000 men, but most were not professional soldiers. They were the furred farmers and villagers pressed into service, armed with axes, spears, and whatever weapons they could find. At the core of Harold's army, though, were his House Car's elite, battle-hardened warriors trained to fight with deadly 2-handed axes. Harold knew his best chance lay in defense. His men locked their shields together in a long, solid line across the ridge. This shield wall was a wall of wood and iron, difficult for any army to break. For generations, it had been the backbone of English warfare, a formation that could hold off larger, stronger forces. The plan was simple: stand firm, resist the Norman attacks, and let William's army break against their wall like waves crashing against a cliff. William's army was different, more professional, more diverse, and more versatile. He had, perhaps, 7,000 to 8,000 men divided into 3 lines. In front were the archers, armed with longbows and crossbows, ready to rain arrows on the English line. Behind them came the infantry, swords and spears in hand, disciplined and organized. And behind them, the deadliest weapon of all, the cavalry. Knights on horseback, heavily armored, their lances glinting in the pale sun. This was the first time England would face a large-scale cavalry charge. The English shield wall had never been tested against mounted knights. The battle began with a whistle through the air. Norman archers loosed their arrows in great arcs, darkening the sky before they came down on the English line. But arrows alone couldn't break the shield wall. Many Englishmen raised their shields overhead, deflecting the deadly rain. Stood firm, their position on the ridge making it hard for the arrows to hit with lethal force. William had hoped to soften Harold's line, but the English barely flinched. The shield wall held, then came the infantry. Norman foot soldiers surged uphill, shouting war cries, their armor clanking, their shields raised. They clashed against the English wall, hacking and stabbing, but Harold's men stood shoulder to shoulder. Axes came down with terrifying force, splintering Norman shields and cutting through helmets. Spears thrust forward from behind the English line, striking down those who came too close. For every step the Normans tried to take uphill, the English forced them back. It was chaos shouts, steel on steel, the cries of the wounded but through it all, the English line refused to break. Seeing his infantry falter, William unleashed his cavalry. Norman knights spurred their horses forward, charging up the hill with lances lowered. The thunder of hooves shook the earth as they slammed into the English shield wall. For a moment, it seemed the Normans might break through. Horses crashed into shields, knights swung swords from above, but Harold's men dug in, axes swinging with brutal precision. One housecarl brought his axe down on a charging knight's horse, cutting it down in a single blow. The rider tumbled into the mud and was hacked to pieces before he could rise. Again and again, Norman knights hurled themselves against the wall, only to be repelled. The shield wall was working. The English seemed unbreakable. But battles are not won by strength alone. They are won by cunning and, sometimes by luck. At one point, the left wing of the Norman army began to falter. Rumors spread through the ranks that William had been killed. Panic rippled through the Normans. Soldiers began to retreat downhill, some fleeing outright. For Harold's men, this looked like victory. Some English soldiers, breaking discipline, abandoned the shield wall to chase the retreating Normans. They rushed downhill, cutting down their enemies as they fled. Was not dead. In fact, he was very much alive and furious. To prove it, he lifted his helmet high so his men could see his face. Rallying his knights, he charged into the retreat, cutting down English pursuers and turning the flight into a deadly trap. The English who had broken formation were slaughtered. And William had learned something vital. The shield wall could not be broken head-on, but it could be tricked. William decided to use this lesson again. Twice more, he ordered his men to pretend to retreat, luring parts of the English line downhill. And twice more, English soldiers took the bait. Every time they broke formation, Norman cavalry wheeled around and cut them down. Slowly, piece by piece, the shield wall was thinning. Harold's discipline was crumbling. By afternoon, the battlefield was a nightmare of mud, blood, and corpses. Both sides were exhausted, but the Normans still had their cavalry and archers, while the English had only their dwindling shield wall. William made a final gamble. He ordered his archers to fire again this time, not straight, but high into the air, in a deadly arc designed to rain arrows down on the English behind their shields. And it worked. One of those arrows struck Harold himself, piercing his eye. Accounts differ. Some say it blinded him, others that it killed him instantly. What is certain is that Harold fell, and with him fell the spirit of the English army. As word spread that Harold was dead, the English line began to collapse. Fled in panic, others fought to the death, surrounding Harold's body in a desperate last stand. His housecarls, loyal to the very end, swung their axes until they were cut down one by one. By nightfall, the shield wall was gone. The Normans stood victorious, bloodied but unbroken. William, once Duke of Normandy, now stood as the undisputed master of England's future. The Battle of Hastings was over, but its impact was just beginning. England's Anglo-Saxon dynasty had ended. Norman knights, castles, and culture would soon dominate the land. The English language itself would be transformed, blending Saxon and Norman French into the beginnings of modern English. For William, the victory was total. Within weeks, he would march to London and be crowned King of England, forever known as William the Conqueror. And yet the battle was not just about one man's ambition. It was about the collision of two worlds: Anglo-Saxon tradition and Norman innovation. On that hill in 1066, the future of a nation was decided in a single, bloody day. Imagine standing on that field as the sun set, the cries of the dying fading into silence. The ground littered with broken shields and lifeless bodies. To the Normans, it was the dawn of a new age. To the English, it was the end of an old one. The Battle of Hastings wasn't just a fight, it was the birth of modern England. The battlefield of Hastings had fallen silent. The bodies of Harold Godwinson and thousands of his warriors lay scattered across Senlac Hill, the blood-soaked earth bearing witness to a day that changed England forever. But for William, Duke of Normandy, now William the Conqueror, victory at Hastings was only the beginning. Winning a battle was one thing, holding an entire kingdom was another. After Hastings, William did not immediately rush to London to seize the throne. His army was battered, his men exhausted, and the countryside seething with anger. Every village and town he passed through could rise against him. So William moved cautiously, advancing through the south of England in a deliberate, terrifying display of power. Wherever resistance flared, he crushed it without hesitation. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, livestock seized. The message was clear: defy William, and you would be left with nothing but ashes. Fear spread as fast as his army marched. By the time he reached the outskirts of London, many of England's nobles had already decided it was safer to bend the knee than to resist. On Christmas Day, 1066, William entered Westminster Abbey, surrounded by Norman knights and English clergy. He was crowned King of England. The echo of "God Save King William" filled the abbey, though outside, the streets burned with riots and resistance. Even in his moment of triumph, England was not yet his. The years after Hastings were anything but peaceful. Across England, rebellions erupted like wildfires. In the north, powerful Anglo-Saxon lords refused to accept a Norman king. In the west, resistance was fueled by Welsh allies. In the east, rebels found support from the Danes, who still dreamed of reclaiming England. William's response was ruthless. The most infamous example came in 1069 to 1070, when a great rebellion rose in northern England. Joined by Danish forces, the rebels captured York and slaughtered Norman garrisons. For a moment, it seemed as if William's hold on England might collapse. But William's revenge was swift and merciless. He unleashed what came to be known as the harrying of the North. Norman soldiers burned entire villages, slaughtered livestock, and salted fields. Crops were destroyed just before winter, leaving tens of thousands to starve. Chroniclers wrote that from York to Durham, not a house was left standing. It was more than a military campaign, it was deliberate terror. By the time it was over, large swaths of northern England were depopulated wastelands. Rebellion had been crushed, but at a terrible cost. William knew fear alone was not enough. He needed permanent symbols of Norman power structures that would remind the English every single day who ruled them. And so the Normans built castles. Unlike the wooden halls of the Anglo-Saxons, Norman castles were massive fortresses of stone, towering above towns and villages. They weren't just defensive structures. They were tools of psychological warfare. The most famous of these was the Tower of London, begun in 1078, rising above the Thames. It was more than a fortress, it was a statement. Every Englishman who saw it understood the Normans were here to stay. Gah. Across England, dozens of castles sprang up: Windsor, Warwick, Durham. Each one was planted like a flag of domination, manned by Norman knights, who kept the population under watch. For the common English villager, the sight of a castle on the horizon was a constant reminder. Rebellion was hopeless. William also knew he could not trust England's existing nobility. Most had fought against him at Hastings, and even those who bent the knee were potential threats. So William stripped them of their lands and titles, redistributing vast estates to his Norman followers. By the end of his reign, over 90% of English land was in Norman hands. Anglo-Saxon earls and thanes were replaced by French-speaking lords loyal to William. This reshaping of society was brutal, but effective. The old Anglo-Saxon ruling class was erased in a single generation. In its place rose a new Norman aristocracy, one that owed everything to William. This transformation wasn't just about land. It was about culture. The Normans brought with them a new language, French. For centuries after the conquest, French was the language of the court, the nobility, and the law. English survived in the mouths of commoners, but it was pushed aside in government and society, and yet, over time, the two languages merged. The Anglo-Saxon cow in the field became the French beef on the table. House became mansion. Kingly became royal. What emerged was a hybrid tongue, the beginnings of modern English. In many ways, the English we speak today was born from William's conquest. William was not content to simply rule by fear. He wanted to know in detail what exactly he ruled. In 1085, he ordered a massive survey of his kingdom, the Domesday Book. Teams of royal officials traveled across England, recording every piece of land, every farm animal, every mill, every person who owed taxes or service. The result was astonishing. A detailed snapshot of 11th century England unlike anything in Europe. For William, it was a tool of control, ensuring no land or wealth escaped his grasp. For historians today, it remains one of the most remarkable documents of the medieval world. The English called it Doomsday because, like Judgment Day, it seemed final and inescapable. Whatever was written in the book, they believed, could never be undone. Despite his ruthless methods, William was always walking a tightrope. He had to manage not only rebellious English subjects, but also ambitious Norman lords, restless to carve out more power. At the same time, he could not forget his homeland of Normandy, which remained the foundation of his strength. To balance these pressures, William perfected the art of centralized rule. Unlike Anglo-Saxon kings who relied heavily on local nobles, William made sure ultimate authority flowed from him. Castles, sheriffs, and the Domesday Survey all were tools too. Make sure no lord grew too powerful. and no village escaped his reach. England was becoming not just conquered territory, but a kingdom tightly bound under one ruler's will. Even within his own family, William faced challenges. His eldest son, Robert, nicknamed Curthos for his short legs, was ambitious and rebellious. Robert wanted more power, and William, unwilling to divide his authority, refused. The result was bitter conflict between father and son. At one point, Robert even allied with William's enemies, forcing the conqueror into open battle against his own child. It was a reminder that conquest abroad meant little if your own blood turned against you. By the time William grew old, his conquest was secure. England was transformed. The Anglo-Saxon elite had been replaced. Castles and fortresses dotted the landscape. Norman law, language, and customs dominated. And the people of England, once proud and independent, lived under the iron fist of a foreign king. But William was not loved. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described his rule as harsh and heavy, marked by greed for gold and power. To many English, he was not the conqueror but the tyrant. And yet there was no denying his effectiveness. William had done what no other foreign invader had accomplished. He had not only conquered England, but remade it in his own image. In his later years, William grew heavier, more cautious, but no less determined. His final campaign came not in England, but in France, where he defended his Norman lands. In 1087, while leading a raid against the French, William's horse stumbled, throwing him against the saddle pommel. The injury left him mortally wounded. He was carried to Rouen, where he died, not in his adopted kingdom of England, but in his native Normandy. Even in death, William's story was marked by chaos. When his body was brought to Cannes for burial, a fire broke out in the city, scattering mourners. Later, as priests tried to lower his corpse into the tomb, they discovered the grave was too small. They forced the body in. It ruptured, filling the church with a stench so foul that the ceremony had to be cut short. It was a grim, almost humiliating end for a man who had once bent kingdoms to his will. Yet William's legacy lived on. His descendants ruled England for centuries. The political system he created, centralized, organized, ruthless, became the foundation of the English monarchy. And the cultural transformation he unleashed reshaped not only England, but the entire English-speaking world. Without William, there would be no modern English, no Tower of London, no Norman legacy etched into the very identity of Britain. Love him or hate him, William the Conqueror was one of the most consequential figures in history. Picture the England William left behind. Castles on every horizon, Norman lords in every hall, a language forever changed, and a people living under the shadow of conquest. For the English, it was the loss of an old world. For William, it was the creation of a new one. And for history, it was the moment England was forever transformed.